Institute of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, IOPGA's mission is to deepen discourse and raise understanding. Before we begin tonight, some housekeeping. This is our last event of the semester calendar year. A full calendar of events will be out soon, but here are some to look forward to. On January 26, 2022 at 7 p.m., we will discuss global challenges with Georgette Bennett. On February 2nd, 2022 at 7 p.m., we will discuss the state of America's politics with Bret Stephens. On March 9th, 2022 at 7 p.m., A Tale of an Afghan Interpreter with Fareed Ferdows. As always, to register for programs, go to our website, iopga.cornell.edu. And then also just real quick, a couple of notable attendees this evening, and we welcome them. New York Assemblyman Chuck Levine, former Congressman from the great state of Connecticut, Chris Shays, and the former Congressman from the great state of Texas, Martin Frost. Welcome, gentlemen. We're delighted to have you this evening. Now to the main event. Joining us this evening, our distinguished guests, former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and my co-moderator, Professor Doug Kreiner at Cornell. Congressman, Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. His bio is incredible, and I'm happy to read it for you. Speaker Newt Gingrich is chairman of Gingrich 360, a multimedia production and consulting company based in Arlington, Virginia. As former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr. Gingrich is known as the architect of the contract with America that led the Republican Party to victory in 1994. Creating the first conservative majority in the House in 40 years. He was a Republican candidate for the President of the United States in 2012. Gingrich is a Fox News contributor, podcast host called Newt's World, and syndicated columnist. He is the author of 41 books. You read that right. 41 books, including 18 fiction and nonfiction New York Times bestsellers. His latest books include Beyond Biden, Rebuilding the America We Love, and Trump and the American Future, Solving the Great Problems of Our Time. Gingrich and his wife, Ambassador Callista L. Gingrich, host and produce historical and public policy documentaries. Recent films include The First American and Divine Mercy, the canonization of John Paul II. Recognized internationally as an expert on world history, military issues, and international affairs, Newt Gingrich is the longest serving teacher of the Joint Warfighting Course for Major Generals. He also teaches officers from all 6 services as distinguished visiting scholar and professor at the National Defense University. In addition, Newt Gingrich served as a member of the Defense Policy Board. He was a member of the Terrorism Task Force for the Council on Foreign Relations, and he co-chaired the Task Force on United Nations Reform, a bipartisan congressional effort to modernize and improve the United Nations. The Gingriches reside in McLean, Virginia, and have 2 daughters and 2 grandchildren. Welcome, Speaker.
It's good to be here.
Thank you. And my co-moderator, Professor Kreiner. Professor Kreiner is the Clinton Rossiter Professor in American Institutions in the Department of Government at Cornell University. And he is the faculty director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. And Doug, it is an absolute pleasure to work with you at IOPGA. So, Speaker, if you don't mind just jumping into some questions, we would love to chat with you tonight. A heartfelt thank you for joining us this evening, particularly during this busy holiday season. Your incredible bio, your 41 books, you have done so much in recent American history. 1994, how did it all start? How did you pull it off? How did you bring a Republican majority after 40 years? Tell us the secret.
Well, let me say, first of all, that I ran 3 times to win. I lost in 74 during Watergate, and I lost in 76 with Jimmy Carter at the head of the Democratic ticket in Georgia. And so when I finally won in 78, I went and saw the leadership and said, look, we've been in the minority for 24 years. And they said, yeah. And I said, don't you think we ought to have a plan to become a majority? And they said, that's a great idea. Why don't you chair the planning committee? So, because none of them believed it was possible. And they certainly didn't believe in planning. So here I was, before I was sworn in, I became chairman of the planning committee, which had the power of titles is amazing. It meant that I could work with Republican National Committee Chair Bill Brock, and we collaborated looking at the Thatcher campaign in '79, and then working with the Reagan campaign. And so out of all proportion to being a freshman, I had access to ideas and resources. But I would remind people, if you're measuring, if success is a majority, we lost in 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, and 92. So you had to get back up every 2 years, try to figure out what you had learned and go back at it. And finally, when 94, part of it was we learned in a special election in 85 in Texas, we just weren't big enough. We were like a mid-sized college team trying to play in the Super Bowl. Democrats were so much bigger than we were as a competitive organization. So I spent a good bit of the next 8 years developing an organization called GOPEC, which I just spoke at today, and developing an internal organization called the Conservative Opportunity Society, which I met with about 2 weeks ago, and which I founded 39 years ago. And we gradually built up the strength so that by 93, we were organized enough that if the opportunity took place, we could win. I think it required having a Democrat in the White House, and it required that they make a mistake very similar to what Obama did in 2009 and what Biden has done this year. And that is, if you win as a moderate and you promptly side with the congressional Democrats who are dramatically more liberal than the country, you create a very big backlash. And that's what Clinton did. He accepted the sort of advice of the congressional Democrats, moved very far to the left by the standards of that era, and created an opportunity. We had grown big enough that we could take advantage of the opportunity. But my theory of this, partly learned from Reagan and Thatcher, whose shoulders I stand on, and without whom I don't think we would have gotten this done. My theory of it was that if you just ran an anti-Clinton, anti-Democrat campaign, you'd probably gain 25 seats, but you wouldn't gain a majority. So we had to have something positive that gave us the marginal difference. We also needed something positive to change the culture of the House Republican Party. And so the Contract with America was created with two different goals. Goal number one was to give our candidates something positive to talk about. Goal number two was, by getting them to sign it, to radically change their behavior in January and February after we won. The only person who's written about this accurately is Chuck Schumer, who wrote a book about 2007. I did an event with him at the National Press Club, and he pointed out that the Contract with America was actually a radical modernization project aimed at the House Republican Party more than at the country. The other thing we did that was really important, and that will play a big role in 22 and 24, was for the first time we broke out and we ran everywhere. We had candidates in every congressional district except 3. That had never happened before. And the result was we were winning races that, if you'd been practical and had listened to the so-called experts, you'd never have competed in. We beat Ross Stankowski, chairman of Ways and Means in downtown Chicago. We beat Jack Brooks, chairman of Judiciary in the Houston suburbs. And we beat the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, in Spokane, Washington. You would never have designed a campaign around those kind of districts, but by flooding the zone and running people everywhere, we created an opportunity, which I would point out, Ed Doer Jr. in New Jersey a few weeks ago, an independent truck driver who got angry because he couldn't get his concealed carry permit, ran against a state senator, the president of the state senate, who 4 years ago won with a $17 million campaign with 58, almost 59% of the vote. Now, Doer won with $2,300. Most of it spent at Dunkin' Donuts on coffee and donuts for his volunteers. The rest spent to print paper handouts. That was his whole ad campaign, was handouts. no advertising, no television, no social media. But what happened was people walked in, they didn't have any idea who Ed Durr was, but they knew who the Senate president was, and they said, not him. And Durr won. It's very similar to the model. I was just told this afternoon that in Virginia, the key to our winning control this year is we went from 40 Democrats in the last cycle not having an opponent for the state legislature to 1 this time. So we ran against 39 seats we didn't run in 4 years ago. And that's why we were able to pick up a majority as well as winning the governorship, of course. So that's probably too long an answer, but I hope it gives you some framework. This was a very complicated project. It took an enormous number of mistakes, having to learn year after year after year. And I don't think we ever would have become a majority without that 16-year period of gradually growing a system big enough and smart enough to be competitive. But the amazing thing was, once we won, we had changed the whole balance of power in Washington. And ever since, we've been competitive in the House, which we had not really been for 68 years. We'd won twice for 1 term and lost immediately. And now we are clearly, in fact, I suspect we'll have a remarkably big majority next year.
So that's my next question. Can 1994 be replicated in 2022? Do you see some similarities there, or is it a whole new year?
Well, no, look, I think history, you get spirals, you don't get circles. So in the spiral, we're back at a point where for the first time since 94, I'm advocating that we have a contract with America. I think that Kevin McCarthy has the right attitude. He very carefully got candidates last year. He was supposed to lose 25 seats. He won 15, which was a swing of 40 from what people expected. Every seat he picked up was either a minority or a woman, or in some cases, a minority woman. So he was changing the makeup of the House Republican Party towards a more inclusive, more positive, and more idea-oriented party. And he had a project he called his commitment to America, which is sort of his variation on the contract. So I think there are big similarities. I do 3 newsletters a week that are free and 3 podcasts that are free at Gingrich 360. I did one recently talking about the tsunami and saying that the wave that's going to hit next year is really so large, people will look back on it and think of it as a tsunami. And I think the left wing of the Democratic Party is carrying them into a disaster of historic proportions.
Professor Kreiner, you want to take the next question for me?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for joining us. So political polarization is nothing new in American politics. The 1990s weren't exactly a time of bipartisan harmony. But in what ways are politics different now than they were when you were Speaker? And what differences that we sort of focus on sometimes are a little bit overblown in your assessment?
Well, I think it's a great question. It's one people wrestle with a lot. And I would make a couple of observations. I think, first of all, that the social media has been much more polarizing than we might have expected, making it more expensive to try to be reasonable because particularly on Twitter, what you get are the haters and on both sides of the aisle. And so if either side starts to move towards a middle ground, they promptly get beaten up. Second, I think that the Democratic left is much further left than it used to be. You can make the same argument for some of the right-wing Republicans, but they're much less important in the party than the left is in the Democratic Party, and just in sort of terms of size and numbers and influence. I think also the change in the pace of life. Let me give you an example. Bob Michael lived in Peoria, Illinois. Denny Rostenkowski lived in Chicago. Every Monday they would meet at a parking lot in Indiana, and one or the other would drive from Indiana to Washington, and they would talk. Sometime during the week they'd go out and they would golf, usually at Burning Tree. And then on Friday they would get back in the car, drive all the way back to Indiana together, and then go their separate ways. Well, they've been doing this for over 20 years. They knew each other's families. They knew about the birth of children. They knew about illnesses. They saw each other as human beings. Nobody on the Republican side has any social relationship with Nancy Pelosi. I don't think a single person. And I don't think Pelosi is the kind of person who wants a relationship. Rostenkowski, like Tip O'Neill, was an old-time ward politician. He liked people. He didn't just like power. He liked people. Bob Michael was the same way. All of those traits have been subsumed by a dramatically more ideologically driven and power-driven model that makes it very hard to see in the short run, how you're going to get anything done. And I'll just give you one example out of and I'm not defending Trump or the toughness of Republicans. I'm just saying, from our standpoint, when you get an inaugural address from Biden that is very positive, you read the address, actually, it's pretty encouraging. And then you learn that the very day he's telling us about being bipartisan and working together, he's repealing, I think, 26 of Trump's executive orders with no coordination with Republicans. Well, so you say, okay, let me get this straight. You gave a really nice speech, but none of your behavior fits your speech. And I think that's the kind of thing that's going on that makes it really hard to figure out how we're going to get out of the current mess.
Thank you. A second question, if you don't mind. The passing of Senator Dole has led many of us to reflect on his place in Senate history and the contemporary state of the institution to which he devoted so much. So as a man of the House, could I ask you to step outside of your comfort zone maybe for a moment and ask your assessment of the contemporary Senate? Is it broken or can it still work?
No, I think it does work, actually. In a way, I would argue it works better than the House, because the House is, the House is really not doing much legislative business in the traditional sense. They're not having ideas go to committee and to subcommittee. They have hearings to know what the hell they're doing. They're ramming through big complex bills that nobody's read. That's not good legislation. I mean, maybe good power. And certainly Pelosi is probably the most powerful speaker in American history if you measure just by her ability to ram through things, particularly with such a tiny majority. But the Senate is supposed to be a cumbersome, difficult to operate, slow institution. And it always has been. I was with George Mitchell, who is certainly a very smart, very competent Democratic leader. And we were together one night at some charitable fundraising event, sitting at the head table. And he had just come from the middle of a huge fight in which Bob Byrd was on what had split the Democratic Party and wanted to get specific things done for West Virginia. And we were talking about the fact that the Senate was working about the way the founding fathers wanted it to. They wanted, remember the first 6 years, they took no votes in public. There were no recorded votes in the Senate for 6 years. It met in secret. They thought of it as sort of the House of Lords. That all broke down pretty fast. But there was this whole sense that I think it's Washington, although it may be apocryphal, but I think it was Washington who said that the Senate was supposed to be the cooling saucer to the hot cup of coffee from the House. And in that sense, it's doing about what it should be, particularly if you think about it. They have a 50-50 vote with the vice president making the difference. Well, I think the founding fathers would have said, in that setting, you shouldn't do very much because you don't have, the country hasn't made a decision. When the country makes a decision, as with Reagan in 1980 or with FDR in 1932, then you can do a lot really fast. But if the country is genuinely split, it's dangerous to have Washington start imposing things on the rest of the country, and the country will ultimately rebel against it.
If you don't mind, just one real quick follow-up. Is there a time when you were speaker that you, even during unified government, when Republicans controlled the Senate, you were just super frustrated by the very different pace and procedures in the upper chamber?
I don't think so, because I was a historian and I was an Army brat, and I was used to the limitations. I had a number of friends, Connie Mack of Florida and Trent Lott of Missouri, Mississippi, for example, who had gone to the Senate. I remember one night I was over there having dinner with them in the Senate, the restaurant, and I said, will you guys explain to me how this place works. I mean, I've always told audiences that culturally, the Senate is a country club and the House is a truck stop. And if you can get that in your head, you understand an enormous amount about how different the two places are. And members of the House as truck stoppers can get to the Senate, and within 2 weeks, they're senators. And so it's probably rivals the Marine Corps as an acculturation system. And they become the senator. I called a very close friend of mine shortly after he'd been elected, and he had turned into the senator, and his staff said, "The senator will be with you in a minute." And I thought, you know, this is so different from the House. So I said to them, I mean, tell me what you guys have learned about how this place works. And Lott had been the Republican on the Rules Committee in the House. He'd been a former Democrat who'd worked as a staffer on the Rules Committee. He really understood the House as an institution. And Connie Mack was just one of the smartest guys I ever worked with. So I knew I had pretty good people here. They said, there are two things to remember about the Senate. First, there are no rules. And second, everything is by unanimous consent. So unless you can set it up so you can get unanimous consent, you don't have any leverage. And people are careful about using that, because if you block too much, everybody else will gang up on you and they'll block everything you want to do. So there's kind of an armed truce, sort of like one of those Westerns where everybody's carrying a gun. And the gun is blocking unanimous consent. The two people, by the way, who really got around that were Jesse Helms, who's a Republican from North Carolina, and Bob Byrd, who had been leader of the Senate and was from West Virginia. Because both of them were so tough and so mean that they didn't care what you did to them. And so if they felt strongly about something, they would just have the other 99 senators mad at them. And they wouldn't care. They just go, I'm doing my job, you do your job. You know, I don't care. I don't care if it inconveniences you and you can't get to your daughter's graduation. You know, give me what I want and you'll get to your daughter's graduation. And both of them had mastered disability and everybody else knew it. And so actually nobody would pick fights with them, because I remember one time a very sophisticated senator said to me, Bob Byrd came to my office. This was a Republican. He said, and when my staff person came in and said, Senator Byrd is in the waiting room to see you, I thought, oh my God, what have I done wrong? Was Bob going to come in here and tear off my arm? And actually one day he wanted his help on something, which is why he'd gone to his office to ask him to help. But the initial reaction to Byrd, even more than Helms, was just abject fear.
Speaker, jumping back to the House now, how, if at all, has the role of Speaker changed since you were in that seat?
Well, first of all, I'd recommend to all of the people listening that they get Dick and Lynn Cheney's book, Kings of the Hill, which is a superb book in which in the, I think, 4th edition actually has a chapter about me. They really look at people who defined the House. I mean, they call it Kings of the Hill, but it's actually about the House of Representatives. And it's a marvelous book. And you could argue that the first really powerful speaker is Tom Reed of Maine. And Reed had a position that the Democrats, as the minority, had no role except to try to become the majority. And so he closed them out totally. And they used to have a rule that you had to have a quorum, you had to have people in their seats in order to operate. And the Democrats decided that they would not answer. So they couldn't count a quorum because they'd say, you know, Mr. Jones of Alabama, and he wouldn't answer, so he couldn't be counted as president, even though he's sitting there. And so finally one day, Reed got totally mad about it, got the sergeant at arms, had everybody in the building, in the room, locked the doors. And when they got to the very first Democrat who did not answer, Reed said, present. And the guy said, you can't say I'm present. And Reed said, well, how come you're objecting if you're not present? And so he just went around the room and he personally counted all the Democrats, totally broke the rules as they'd existed up to that point. And in some ways, Pelosi's in the Reed tradition of just making up whatever rules she wants. And Reed operated on the basis of power. If I have 218 votes, but that wasn't the right number back then, but today it'll be 218. If If I have 218 votes, I can do anything I want to as long as I can keep 218. And you can't do anything to stop me.
And do you think the role of the speaker will continue to evolve? If the
Sure.
Republicans are successful in 20, do you think it's going to be a lot different from your time in the House?
Well, I mean, I think it always evolves. I think, if you go back to Sam Rayburn, who was, I think, the longest serving speaker, Rayburn actually was very careful and worked through the committee chairs, and the committee chairs gave him power. But he wasn't, Joe Cannon, for whom a building is named, Tom Reed, Nancy Pelosi are in the centralized power speakerships. It's personal to them. And in fact, in Cannon's case, he finally got people so mad at him that the progressive Republicans joined the Democrats on a motion of no confidence and basically fired him. And he was totally crushed and humiliated. And they then said, no, we want you to stay as speaker, but these are the new rules. And they invented the discharge petition to get bills out, even if the speaker wanted to stop them, and did some other things. And he stayed for a while, but and then the Democrats took over after the next election at the beginning of the Woodrow Wilson era. But so it's always evolving. I mean, certainly McCarthy will be a much more collegial speaker, and the system will have much more of a traditional legislative process with the committees holding hearings, marking up bills, et cetera.
Now, Mr. Speaker, if I could interrupt for 1 second, because we do have a question in the chat room. It's saying, is it Speaker McCarthy or is it Speaker Trump? Because there has been a push.
That's just no, that's silly. That's totally silly. I mean, I haven't talked to Trump about it, but if he asked me, I would tell him, you cannot have a speaker who doesn't have an ability to understand all of the members. And to do that, you have to be a member of the House. Now, the idea that somebody will be parachuted in and they will be brilliant is a sign of total lack of understanding of the power structure of the House. You have to have somebody who knows why each member is there, what they're trying to get done, what they need to get reelected. And if you don't have that kind of detailed knowledge, you can't play. And so the idea that whether it's Trump or it's Barack Obama, they couldn't get anything done. They don't know enough about the House.
Now, how do you think history will judge you?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, it'll judge me at one level. One level will judge me as a revolutionary and a very successful engineer of electoral politics. The only person in your lifetime to balance the budget 4 straight years. You're able to work with Bill Clinton, even while we were impeaching him. He and I could work together. We had a unique chemistry. We were both kind of graduate students, and we get together and BS exactly like graduate students. We spent 35 days together crafting the balanced budget face to face in the cabinet room. I think I would also say that I overreached, that I ultimately burned out, and that I centralized power probably too much because I was so determined to get so many things done. And remember, from my standpoint, I'm the first speaker in 40 years who's a Republican. I am trying to get things done by maneuvering a Democratic president into breaking with his own party. And I did that mostly by appealing to the American people and making it too dangerous for Clinton to be on the other side. That's why he came to the Congress and said that the era of big government was over, which was I was sitting there behind him when he said it at the State of the Union. It was certainly a shock, and I had to get up and give him a standing ovation, because what are you going to do if you're a Republican and you have this Democrat saying the era of big government's over? I would recommend to everybody who's listening, there's a terrific small book by Tom Evans called The Education of Ronald Reagan, which is a study of Reagan at General Electric. You can best understand me as a student of Reagan and Thatcher. And as much as I'd worked with Reagan, starting really in '74 when I first ran for Congress. It was only when I read this book about 10 years ago that I fully understood what his strategies were and how he did it, but I instinctively had adopted them. And so my model was we would arouse and move the country. The country would then move Clinton. Clinton would then agree to sign something. And it came, in the original version, it came from a Reagan line when he said that his job was to focus the light on the American people so they could turn up the heat on Congress. And then he didn't believe in negotiating directly with Congress. He believed in getting the American people to apply pressure.
Mhm. Hey, you referred to yourself and President Clinton as graduate students. So we have a lot of undergraduate students at Cornell University listening tonight. And, there's been a bit of a toxic environment lately in politics. And I think Professor Kreiner, and I know Congressman Israel and Cornell are so dedicated to getting the youth engaged in government, in public service. What can you tell the students listening today about getting involved in public service and, just moving forward and trying to block out all the negativity that they hear?
Well, I would probably go in a different direction than you might expect. I co-authored a novel called To Try Men's Souls, which is about Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas night in a snowstorm on an icy river. The American Army had dropped from 30,000 in September to 2,500. 1/3 of the 2,500 did not have boots and were marching in burlap bags, leaving a trail of blood. They were desperate for victory, and Washington knew that if they couldn't win somewhere, that the whole army was going to disintegrate and that the revolution would be over, and he and all of his leaders would be hung as traitors. It's one of the most extraordinary stories in history. They got Thomas Paine to write a pamphlet called The Crisis, which begins, "These are the times that try men's souls." And what I would say to everybody who's listening tonight is simple. If you want America to be free at the end of your life, you had better spend a good bit of your life in public service. We are in desperate trouble of collapsing as a country. We have schools that are incapable of competing with China. We have a military that is decaying. We have big cities that don't function. We have a murderously rising crime rate. We have failed to think through and solve the challenge of immigration. We have bureaucracies that are industrial era dinosaurs that can't get their job done. And we have large corporations that cheerfully rip off the taxpayer for the benefit of the quarterly report. None of that can be solved without a new wave of young people who have the courage to go out and master the art of self-government and learn how to make it work. And I would say to them, you just have to decide. If you're willing to avoid public service and you're willing to be passive as your country collapses, that's certainly a prerogative. But late in your life, you will look back and regret deeply that you didn't sign up and do your part to help save America.
Well, with that, Mr. Speaker, I have 4 very active, engaged Cornell students who are eager to ask you questions. So Emily, can you introduce the Cornell students and have them ask their questions?
Yep, and if anyone else would like to ask a question tonight, you can pose your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to it if we have time at the end. Olivia, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you for your time. Mr. Speaker, your reputation as a congressional leader was combative and incendiary, and materially changed the tone in Washington at the time. Given the continued and worsened divisiveness in Congress, how much responsibility do you take for the vitriol that now exists in politics in the United States? And what advice would you give to someone who strives to bridge the polarization divide in our country that you have been a prominent figure in?
Well, I was faced with a very simple problem. We could avoid being divisive and remain in the minority for 40 more years, because the leaders who had preceded me had been nice, pleasant, go-along guys who had accepted being in the minority and hadn't taken on the Democrats and hadn't led fights and hadn't been prepared to go on offense. And if we were prepared to have another 20 or 30 years of Democratic control, that was the right approach. But if you were going to create a big enough understanding in the country of what was wrong, and you're going to create enough momentum to defeat a 40-year machine, then you had to be prepared to fight. So maybe it's like looking at a football game or a lacrosse match or any other competitive environment. There are two teams out there, and if one of the teams decides they don't want to play, they're going to get beaten in every single game. So I think in that sense we were aggressive and tough. I also think that as a general rule, the things I worked on in the end we passed a lot of
I just need to see something.
We got a lot done. And I think I just lost her.
I think, Olivia, you're still there, right? I think we had a little bit of
Yes, I'm still here.
still there.
Yeah.
Yeah. thank
So
you.
anyway, I think there's a difference between a very tough competition, which I certainly was part of, and as you put it, vitriol. Clinton and I were able to work together even when we were fighting and arguing. And I would say that, the difference is sort of captured. If you look at what happened to a Supreme Court nominee when he and his family were just torn to shreds at a purely personal level on what turned out, I think, to be falsehoods. Nobody in the era that I was involved in was engaged in that. The fact is that when I went after Jim Wright on ethics, it was the Democrats on the ethics committee who forced him to resign because it turned out I was right. Now, I committed the heresy of actually raising the issue, and therefore you could say I was the bad guy because I insisted on an investigation, but the investigation was based on facts. When we went after Clinton, and I've always thought that was totally mishandled in terms of the report that was done, because my concern with Clinton was really simple. It had nothing to do with sex. It had to do with perjury, which is a felony, and which as a Yale lawyer, he knew was a felony. And I thought that it was very dangerous to establish the principle that a president could commit perjury and have no consequence. But even when we were doing that, as I said a while ago, he and I literally were working on Iraq and other issues because we had a very good ability to compartmentalize and to not make it personal. It wasn't, we weren't engaged in total war. We were engaged in a legitimate power struggle, precisely like attorneys in a court case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Emily, do you want to introduce the next speaker?
Yep, next we have Rory. Rory, you can unmute yourself.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. My name is Rory. I'm from Westchester, New York, and I study government here. My question for you is, you focused on this during your time in Congress, and I was just wondering, we talked a lot about the change, but what has remained a consistent issue is the national debt. You mentioned earlier in your remarks that, right now the country doesn't really know what to do. 50-50 Senate, tight House. Is the national debt and all the spending bills that we're passing something that we'll have to maybe punt off in the next congressional cycles, or something that you think we can deal with right now?
Well, I would reestablish the goal of getting to a balanced budget. When we ran, we had a balanced budget, a constitutional amendment in the contract. It passed the House by a constitutional majority with over 300 votes. It fell one vote short in the Senate, but got, I think, 66 votes. And so we sat down and said, wait a second, if you've already had over 300 people vote for a balanced budget, and in the Senate, you've had over 60 people vote for a balanced budget, what if we pretended that it passed? And what if we just went ahead and balanced the budget? And that's what we did. And it turned out it took 4 years to balance it. And it was a combination of really big reforms, really tough spending decisions, and really dramatic economic growth. And I would point out we were making choices. We doubled the size of the National Institute of Health while we were controlling spending. because we concluded that the investment in biological research would pay off so dramatically over time that it was foolish to apply the same standards. So that meant you had to cut other money somewhere else in order to liberate the money for NIH. But in retrospect, it was exactly the right thing to do. So I would say, my advice, because I agree with your general introduction, it's very dangerous to continue sustaining the scale of the deficits. It's dangerous both in a financial sense, but it's also dangerous because it teaches politicians, you might as well add another 100 million because who's going to notice it? So you end up with really bad systems and with really bad spending. The only way I think you can break out of that is to insist on a balanced budget.
Thank you, Rory. Emily, the next student.
Next, we have Sloan.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sloan. I'm from Austin, Texas, and here at Cornell, I'm studying industrial and labor relations. In your newest book, Beyond Biden, you explain that if it were not for the, quote, confused, self-defeating, and poorly run efforts by Republicans in Georgia, unquote, the Senate would be 52-48 today. Which Republicans are you referring to? The two losing senators, the governor, or the AG? And how do you suppose that they contributed to the loss of the 2 Senate seats? In addition, do you believe that President Trump and his unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud in Georgia contributed to the losses of Senator Perdue and Loeffler?
Oh, I think Trump and Governor Kemp and Secretary of State Raffensperger and Senate Leader McConnell, as well as the 2 candidates, all have to be held accountable for what happened. Whether he intended to or not, I think Trump's anger suppressed Republican votes of people who were very pro-Trump. I think that McConnell, by not taking up the $2,000 extra payment, created an easy target for the Democratic candidates. And I think the 2 Republican Senate candidates, frankly, should have just broken with McConnell and been on the side of passing the $2,000. And once Trump proposed it and the Democrats accepted it, it was crazy to not be for it. And you clearly see the result of that in terms of turnout. I think that the governor and Raffensperger, by surrendering to Stacey Abrams in the spring of 2020 and signing a consent agreement that was crazy, that basically allowed for unlimited ballots with no identity, no ability to identify whether or not anybody had voted, set the stage. And I think there's a pretty general agreement that in Fulton County, which is the biggest county in the state, that there was a significant level of corruption in how they counted. So I think all those different pieces come together and all of them bear some burden of responsibility for having lost the 2 seats.
Thank you. And our final student for a question, Emily?
Yes, our final student is Avery. Go ahead, Avery.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for coming to speak with us tonight. My name is Avery. I'm a junior studying government and history from Syracuse, New York, and I'm also a member of the College of Republicans. And so sort of going off of the last question, you obviously served in Georgia's 4th District while in Congress. You have a very sort of, close finger on the pulse in the state. I know you're talking about, all the sort of, figures in Georgia to sort of blame for the loss in the 2021 special election. Perdue, the former Senator Perdue, has challenged Governor Kemp. So I was just wondering, kind of as you've been there and active in the state for so long, how you sort of, assess the strengths and weaknesses of both these candidates running in the gubernatorial primary, and also if you think this challenge to Governor Kemp is going to pretty much play into Stacey Abrams' hand.
Well, I wrote a newsletter about 3 weeks ago arguing that Kemp is so damaged with conservatives that he almost certainly can't win because you can't get a unified party in the general election against Stacey. And I did that after I talked to 2 of the leading pollsters, Matt Towery of Insider Advantage and Robert Cahaley of Trafalgar, both of whom know Georgia very well, and both of whom said independently in separate communications that they thought at least 30% of the party would never vote for Kemp in a general election. Perdue has the ability to unify the party, and I actually think the best argument for Perdue is that he is the person who can defeat Stacey, and that Kemp cannot possibly defeat Stacey. And I noticed in a poll today that the minute Georgia Republicans learned that Perdue was supported by Kemp, was supported by Trump, that he tied Governor Kemp without any campaign even having occurred yet. So I think, an incumbent governor who has dropped down and is now faced with a candidate who is tying him on the opening week without having yet campaigned, I think is in deep trouble. And my guess is that, and this is a guess, that Perdue will in fact end up winning the election.
Thank you. And thank you to the 4 students for those great questions. Speaker, we have so many questions in the chat, and I'm trying to dive into them and try to find some similar ones so I can group them together. So let me just jump into this one right now, if you don't mind. Michael Parkinson asks, the loss of personal connection, shared experience, and the essence of common interests, which you highlight in your experience, is frankly scary. An extreme right is pulling Republicans more than extreme left is pulling Democrats. How can reasonable people, elected or candidates, move us to a better future?
Well, I think it's a real challenge, and part of it is that it's an accurate reflection of the country. And it's not just about politicians in Washington, but go around from San Francisco to Mobile, Alabama, and you'll realize this is a very, very diverse country. And so part of it is that you have pressures building on both sides. I would argue much more heavily on the Democratic side, where the so-called progressive wing is much, much bigger proportionally than the hard right is in the Republican Party. But in either case, without getting into an argument about scale, you have people who have a different frame of reference. They live in a different world. When you have, for example, a genuine communist as the prosecutor in San Francisco, somebody whose father is still serving jail time for having killed a Brinks guardsman in a robbery in the late 60s designed to finance the revolution, almost an imitation of Stalin as a bank robber in Georgia around 1900. The gap between that and, say, Governor Abbott or Governor DeSantis is astonishing. And so a lot of the tension isn't because people are stupid. It's because they genuinely believe in different worlds, and they sincerely believe in different worlds. And I think that's a significant part of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Another question I have here from Stephen Urdaneta, who is also a Cornell student. I've come to learn that many people in the 1970s and 80s became tired of congressmen constantly trying to compromise and not necessarily trying to fully pass the beliefs that their constituency believed in. However, now we face the opposite, in which people are upset nothing gets done due to partisanship. Even if we come out of an era of polarization, how can we ever find a balance in which citizens are not concerned about too much compromise, but also not worried about gridlock?
Well, I think part of it, the way it has happened in the past, and it's happened before in American history, is eventually issues evolve which build such huge majorities that people drift to them because they can't get away from it. I mean, earlier this evening, I was listening to an interview of the sheriff in Los Angeles, who is deeply opposed to the district attorney because the district attorney refuses to lock up criminals. And the sheriff's they're both Democrats. But the sheriff represents an alternative worldview that says putting violent criminals on the street is dangerous, and you're really stupid if you do that. In fact, he used the word stupid to describe the district attorney. The district attorney comes out of a background that says, we really need to understand these people have had a hard life. and maybe they really didn't mean it, and it's a reasonable risk to put them back on the street. It's like New York, where you have no bail. So you pick somebody up, and the police quit picking people up, because if they literally get out of the jail faster than the police can fill out the report, the policeman thinks, as a practical matter, why am I doing this? And then we're shocked that, having learned that they can steal, for example, in California, the district attorney in San Francisco said publicly he would not prosecute anybody who was shoplifting under $900. Well, and, if you're reasonably smart, you go, okay, so if I go and 3 times a day, I pick up $800 items. But as long as they're under $900, I'm fine. And then you end up with these mobs where you have 80 or 90 people going into a Nordstrom and literally just looting it. I think what will happen is presently the country will talk to itself and decide that that's really stupid and dangerous, and they're offended by it. And you'll see a significant coalition grow up of Democrats, Republicans, and independents who say, I don't, if you're a violent criminal, or if you're a thief, or if you're a rapist, I don't want you on the street. And that'll be a very, very substantial shift from the ideological policy of the last 5 or 6 years.
Thank you. I have former Congressman Chris Shays from the great state of Connecticut. He has a question, and I have to give a shout out to Congressman Shays. He participated recently in a Cornell event about Afghanistan. It was our first in-person event after COVID, and we're grateful for his participation. And now his question. Newt, my most satisfying 21 years in Congress were the 4 years you were our speaker and John Kasich was chairman of the Budget Committee in 1975 to 1978. In your judgment, why did we lose seats in the 98 election when Republicans should have gained seats, not lost seats?
I think that we misunderstood how the country would react to the Lewinsky scandal. I think that we misunderstood what Clinton did brilliantly in the Black community. Bill and Hillary Clinton and Jesse Jackson used Black television and Black radio and Black social media, and they got presidential level turnouts in districts where, had we gotten a normal off-year turnout, we would have won. And we were frankly shocked. We thought we would gain 15 seats. I think we lost 6 or 7. We were still a majority, but we lost, and that's frankly part of why I left Congress, because I was like a football coach who had been hired to deliver victories, and they loved me as long as we were winning, and they decided maybe I'd lost my touch, and it was time for somebody new.
Thank you. Next question is from Cinder Hayes. Can you speak about a time when you were grateful that there were Democrats in the House to help rein in a Republican bill?
Well, when we passed it's a good question. It's a great question. When we passed welfare reform, which is the biggest conservative value social reform in my lifetime, we actually split the Democrats. We had 101 Democrats voting yes and 101 voting no. And I thought it was very helpful and very healthy on a reform that size that you had that many Democrats voting with you. And I think that in that sense, really big reforms, you have to bend over backwards to make them bipartisan, or you end up with 10 or 15 or 20 years of bitterness fighting over things. So that would be a good example where I think it really did matter. And frankly, we had some votes. The vote to go to war in 1991 or 1990 was a really vote of conscience because you were voting to put young Americans at risk. And it was really bipartisan. I think there's a sense that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you ought to vote your conscience and not vote partisanship or ideology. And that was a case where we compared notes and we were able to work together. I would also say saving the space station. Bob Walker and I were, Bob Walker's a congressman from Pennsylvania. We were both fanatics about space, and the space station was right at the edge of dying. And we managed to find the last few votes. And without the vote of a number of Democrats, we could not have sustained the space station.
Mhm. I have a question in here from Dan Gottlieb. You mentioned the era of big government ended when you became speaker. How do you define big government? Is it spending, which should not drop, or other factors like regulation?
Well, actually, the person who said that was Clinton, not me. It was in his, I think, 1996 State of the Union as part of his reelection effort. And it was a great line. And he said the era of big government is over. And it sort of took the wind out of our sails because we're going, what are we going to fight with him about if he really believes that? I think big government means all of it. It means the capacity of government to take your money. It means the capacity of government to spend your money. And it means the capacity of government to regulate your life and to tell you what you can and can't do, and to police you. So all those components, the use of government power in a variety of formats, all are part of big government. And obviously, the founding fathers were very realistic. On the one hand, they knew that in order to survive in a dangerous world, you had to have a fairly strong government. They also knew that a fairly strong government was a direct threat to our ability to maintain our freedom. So people tend to forget they wrote the Constitution as much to limit government as to strengthen it. And then they wanted to make sure that they had a government strong enough to defend you from foreign enemies, but a government that was limited in its ability to control you here at home. And they thought that the threat of government was very real. And they would have understood both Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and George Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984, even though they were doing this almost 200 years earlier.
So I think we're getting close to the end. We've got about 3 minutes left. And my last question, I think, is an appropriate way to end the evening. Getting back to students and getting back to the youth of our country and getting them excited to participate in public service. Elliot Cohen asks, how can you advocate for young people to enter public service when public servants are so frequently the target of vicious attacks from colleagues on either side of the aisle, both R and D alike?
Because that's life. Lincoln was described at times as a great ape. Winston Churchill was ridiculed all through the early 1930s. George Washington almost quit after his first term because the New York newspapers were attacking Martha Washington for holding high teas, and they said that was a step towards a monarchy. And he was just livid and furious, and it took both Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton to convince him to run for a second term. When Washington went into Valley Forge, he found that they had one axe, virtually no supplies, partially because there was a faction of Congress that wanted him to fail so they could replace him with the general who had just won the battle north of in New York. And, Washington had to endure all that. He knew that there was probably a third of the Congress actively trying to get him defeated and get him fired. And ultimately, he relied on the Marquis de Lafayette to write a letter to the Congress saying, you do know that if Washington was not in charge of the army, the French king would cut off the money, the ammunition, the weapons, the clothing, everything. But of course, if you want to fire Washington and try to fight the war with no help from France, that's your right. Well, that ended that, and people gave it up. So go back to the very beginning. This is a very tough business. Dick Gephardt, the Democratic leader when I was speaker, always said, politics is the way we sublimate civil war. This is a fight over power. It is not a game. There are very real stakes. People have different desires, different values, different visions of the future. They have different interests. Certainly a Maine lobsterman doesn't have the same interest as a Silicon Valley, computer engineer. And all that somehow has to get blended together short of violence, recognizing the constant tension that's involved. And what I would say to young people is, this is the real world. I always think that one of the great problems of the modern era is that some people watch The Lion King and think it's a documentary. And they think lions and zebras sing and dance together. And they don't realize that lions, in fact, eat zebras. Well, politics is like that. Politics is a very, very tough business. Harry Truman used to say, President Truman, if you need a friend, get a dog. And if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. But he didn't suggest you quit, that you pretend the kitchen doesn't exist. In his mind, the kitchen was politics. He was a very tough politician. He came out of the machine in Kansas City. After he'd been elected, he served one term, and both the Kansas City and St. Louis machines decided to beat him. He spent a year in a car by himself with one driver, crisscrossed the state, just beat the tar out of the two machines, won re-election. And that was the training that let him beat Tom Dewey for president in 1948. He'd been there, he'd done that, he understood it. So yeah, this is tough. And my answer to people is actually a paraphrase of Theodore Roosevelt, who was once ridiculed by his elite aristocratic friends because he went to German and Irish bars. And he said, you know, politics in this city is decided in German and Irish bars. And I want to be in the room when the decisions are made. And you can go to your fancy club and you will have no impact on how this city is run. So that's fine, as long as you're willing to be powerless and let other people do it. Now, I'll close with this thought, which I hope your students will understand and appreciate. I was invited many years ago up to Armonk, which was the IBM headquarters at a time when IBM was certainly regarded itself as the greatest company in the world, and was cheerful about telling you that. And they were telling me how they were above politics. And I just turned on them and said, look, you just told me how smart you are. And now you're telling me you're depriving America of the advice and the counsel of all these smart people. So you're going to be governed by people that, by your own definition, are more mediocre than you are. And as long as you're willing to let your life being decided by mediocre people, that's a fine decision. But then don't whine when that's what happens. And I would say to all the students, you can be in the game, you can be the man in the arena, to use Theodore Roosevelt's line, and it's tough. It's very tough. But on the other hand, you have the sense that you contributed to history, you contributed to your country, you were an active patriot, and you may have helped save freedom for the planet. Not a bad thing to do for a lifetime.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your contribution to the country. Thank you for spending the evening with us. We're grateful. A special thank you to Avery, Sloan, Rory, and Olivia for your questions. And of course, to Professor Kreiner for your questions and participating as well. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays to everyone. We look forward to seeing you in 2022. Best wishes and best of health to everyone. And once again, Mr. Speaker, delighted to see you, and please give our best to Callista.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.